We are driven back, said an old Indian warrior, until we can retreat no farther. Our hatchets are broken, our bows are snapped, our fires are nearly extinguished. A little longer, and the white man will cease to persecute us, for we shall cease to exist.
The Hudson River is the only sea level breakthrough in the Appalachian chain on the eastern seaboard, which to us is nothing. You know, well, you get in the plane, fly over, you don't even see it when you're in the plane. But for centuries, people stood on this side of that barrier and sort of wondered what was on the other side, and they got little dribs and drabs reports. To them, it was a major barrier. The Hudson River is the only sea level avenue through that barrier, and that's why, with the help of the Erie Canal, the development of the West came right through the Hudson, and it came notably through the Hudson Highlands. I mean, that's the breakthrough. Right at West Point, Bear Mountain, that stretch in there, that's the breakthrough. That's not only beautiful, it's historically of incredible significance.
Well, you know, people who couldn't make out here would have to be pretty damn dumb, because you could just skim off the top of the earth and make a fortune. But look how much we've done to this continent, how much we've exploited it. If we had environmental impact statements in the post-Civil War period, I can just hear the howls that would have gone up on the part of some Americans had they said, well, we're going to go into the Great Plains of the Middle West and we're going to get rid of the 60 million buffalo, and we're going to open it up for farming, and we're going to spray it with chemicals. And, you know, people would have said you're out of... Some people would have said you're crazy. Others would have said, hey, man, let's go. But you just can't put that on Americans alone. You can go back to Genesis. You know, a man shall have dominion over the earth. I quarrel with that.
The world was all before them, where to choose their place of rest, and Providence their guide. They hand in hand with wandering steps and slow through Eden took their solitary way. Paradise lost.
The whole power plant case broke open in 1963 when Consolidated Edison announced it was going to build a pump storage plant at Storm King Mountain. That is a plant that would suck water uphill, store it in a giant bathtub or reservoir, and then when power was generated, release it down through the same tunnel through which it had passed, only this time it would turn turbines to meet peak demand.
This 16-acre reservoir here would have been expanded to approximately 250 acres, and at full power pumping it would have contained 8 billion gallons of water, which would have been released daily, partially released, during peak period hours in a consumer service area.
It's really one of the magnificent scenes of the world, and it was this that aroused so many citizens to try to do something to stop what at that time seemed impossible, namely to prevent a utility that had always had its way in this state, as utilities had always had their way in this country, from building a power plant, the Storm King power plant on that hill.
Coupled with that, there was concern about the nuclear plants. There had been enormous fish kills at Indian Point 1. Again, we're back to fish. And these plants were located, as the Storm King plant would have been, in the worst part of the estuary. It's like setting up a machine gun in a nursery ward. The fight went on for 17 years. It was finally resolved after 20 months of negotiations. Scenic Hudson had originally acted on Storm King, later joined on Storm King by the Fishermen's Association, but then the Hudson River Fishermen's Association, with the Natural Resources Defense Council as our attorneys, also intervened on the nuclear plant cases. And the reason the whole case came to a settlement was because we had defeated them with Indian Point by getting a ruling that cooling towers would be required there to protect the fish. So it was the leverage we had at Indian Point that enabled Con Ed to throw in the towel on Storm King.
And all the land that you can see off in this direction were Con Edison lands. Those lands have been now contributed to the state of New York's Palisade Interstate Park Commission, and they're protected forever as wildlands will remain in this state.
But on the other hand, we used all of this 17 years of battle and testimony to say to Con Edison, we want you and the other utilities to put up the money to endow an independent foundation. So the Hudson River Foundation for Science and Environmental Research is now in existence. So it's about $20 million right now. It was a kind of creative solution to healing the wounds, if you want, of the fight that had taken place in the past, but it was an advance for the river. It's a positive step. This is the only river in the world that I'm aware of that has its own private endowment.
It was a landmark decision, and it was prominent indeed in really unleashing the flood of environmental litigation that followed. Scenic Hudson was remarkable, the ability to hang in as long as it did, and that was, in the early phases, I think, primarily due to Stephen Smokey Duggan, and from 1968 on, due almost single-handedly to Fran Reese, who just made it keep going and raise money in one way or another by hook or crook. So it was 17 years. That's an incredible amount of time to have been engaged in a case and to have won it.
Until we get the machinery and the laws and the criteria of what is good for the valley as a whole, we're going to have to keep fighting all these individual little fights, which aren't so little, I might add. Mediation probably would only work if there is a balance of power. With the Con Ed Storm King thing, the big thing was the cooling towers. The cooling towers were the weights in the scale it could balance, and Con Ed was only too glad, I think, they came out with something. Everybody came out with something. But if you come up against a mediation problem where it looks as if all the spoils are going to one, then mediation is out. Storm King is still, to me, the sort of the symbol of a forever commitment to try to look at the river as a whole. With all the powers that man has to be destructive, it was also the symbol of all the powers that we all have to gather around and say, this isn't enough, this isn't what we want.
And it's amazing that, it's as though humanity is speeding along, and we're always about ready to do ourselves in. It's as though we're in a racing car going toward the edge of the cliff, but the edge of the cliff seems to keep moving. It's kind of a trick movie scene. I mean, the Hudson River almost went over. Well, we almost crashed with the river, but we didn't. And we just seemed to learn things in time enough to say, hey, let's change. But there's so much to learn.
The Hudson River Fishermen's Association asked me to be the Hudson River Keeper. And the River Keeper concept was really born in 1969 in Bob Boyle's book, The Hudson River. And Bob in 1969 envisioned the day when there would be a river keeper on the Hudson, based in part on the river keepers they have in England, where they take care of trout streams, salmon streams, usually for private clubs. Go ahead, Bear. So Bob, as president of the Fishermen's Association, was really the father of the idea here. So the Fishermen's Association used $25,000 that they had received in the settlement of the Con Ed case. And we decided we wanted to build a small patrol boat. One of the things that we're proudest of is that our 2 decades of work in the Fishermen's Association has usually been supported by the the spoils of our battles with polluters. And we would like to think that it's polluters and despoilers of the Hudson who would continue to be our main source of support.
I remember starting a page dealing with the environment in the journal probably 20 years ago. And that was when it was described, remember, by one of the Kennedys as an open sewer. And there was big jokes as to when the Hudson would go up in flames. And so there was a big movement, and Rockefeller was in the forefront of it, to bring public money to bear on the problems of the river. And I can recall going down to his giant mansion in Westchester County and meeting with all the editors down there and trying to come up with a way to make sure that that issue was approved by the people. And there was such an enormous interest in it that it went before the voters and it was approved. And with that, all the municipalities, which were the worst polluters, and the corporations that were polluters, began to work on it.
In the end, environmental policies mirror the success of powerful political forces, whether they are newly formed groups or entrenched allies.
All tidal marshes are extraordinarily important. They produce anywhere from 10 to 20 times as much food, biomass, as the best farmland anywhere in the world. And they do it basically at no cost to us. About 80% of all the fin fish and shellfish in the North Atlantic depend upon tidal marshes, like Constitution Marsh, for some stage of their life cycle. They either spawn in these marshes, or in the case of striped bass and shad, which may spawn out in the open Hudson, the young larvae often move into these tidal marshes to spend the summer growing up. Other species spend the winter in these tidal marshes. And the point is, if we lost all of the tidal marshes along the North Atlantic coast, we'd lose about 80% of all the fish and shellfish in the North Atlantic. Constitution Marsh has a couple of distinctions. It appears to be, or at least Foundry Cove, which adjoins Constitution Marsh on the north, is the most heavily cadmium polluted place that anybody has found so far anywhere in the world. In 1952, the Army Signal Corps built a nickel-cadmium battery factory in the village of Cold Spring to make batteries for Nike missiles to be used during the Korean conflict. And after the Korean War was over, the Army leased the battery factory to Sonotone and then later to Marathon. And for about 25 years, these companies produced nickel-cadmium batteries, dumping the waste from this operation, which was basically nickel, cadmium, and some cobalt, first into the Hudson River. For the first 6 years of operation, the waste went directly into the Cold Spring waterfront, into the Hudson River, and from then on, it went into Foundry Cove at the north end of the marsh through a pipe. And right now, we estimate something like 25 to 30 tons of cadmium in Foundry Cove, and possibly almost as much in the Hudson River. The sediments in some places in Foundry Cove are more than 30% elemental cadmium and nickel. Ore this rich doesn't exist anywhere in the world. But cadmium is a toxic heavy metal. It builds up in the central nervous system, the kidneys, the liver. It can cause a number of diseases and eventually death. The site is just too dangerous to let it sit.
This river is the last estuary on the east coast of the United States that still has reliable runs of striped bass, American shad, Atlantic sturgeon, just to name 3 species of fish. Not a single juvenile American shad has been found in the upper nursery grounds of Chesapeake Bay for 11 straight years. When Maryland closed shad fishing in 1980, the catch was down to 30,000 pounds. There's been no improvement. Striped bass in Maryland are on their last legs. Same is true in North Carolina. Up and down the coast, all these estuaries for various reasons. I suspect it's acid rain in the Chesapeake and in the Carolinas and in parts of Canada. These estuaries are being devastated. This is the last numbered Swiss bank account for the coastal environment. You don't sacrifice this.
Every spring, the shad fishermen return to set their nets twice a day at ebb tide, draping them along 1,200 feet of poles. When the tide comes in, these gill nets are lifted and emptied of their catch. Drift nets are also used with floats and weighted at the bottom. The silverbacks are running is the shout that spreads the word as thousands of iridescent shad migrate upriver. Females deposit eggs on the flats between Kingston and Coxsackie. The few young that survive and mature spend the summer in the upper reaches. At 3 to 5 inches of length, they swim downstream and into the ocean. 5 years later, weighing 2 to 5 pounds, they complete the cycle and return to spawn in the Hudson River, the place they first knew life.
Where the sad part comes in is that beginning in 1975 and 76, when consumption of fish was starting to go up, came the PCB revelations and the closing of a good part of the commercial fishery. Fishermen lost their eel fishery, they lost their striped bass fishery, they lost their catfish fishery.
I think that's in.
PCBs are industrial chemicals used in the manufacture of capacitors and transformers because of their fire-retarding abilities. By the time it was understood how dangerous PCBs are as they pass up the food chain through plankton, fish, birds, and mammals, more than 500,000 pounds had been dumped into the Hudson River from General Electric's plant in Fort Edward. GE made a $4 million settlement with New York State, the EPA, and environmentalists. But a decade later, the issue of the river's PCB contamination, perhaps the single most pressing environmental concern, has not been resolved. Removal of the most concentrated sediments to an encapsulated landfill raises fears that dredging will further disperse PCBs downriver. Meanwhile, the river system has not been able to naturally rid itself of the chemically stable PCBs, which cling to organic matter and accumulate in the body fat of living organisms. The striped bass commercial fishery has been lost, and in the upper Hudson, recreational fishing is closed.
Well, I have 5 and 6 gals working on my crew. They're a little neater than the guys. Some have been with me for 15 years, and they work with the live transplant programs with the Pennsylvania Fish Commission. One nice thing about this net, the fish that you don't want, you can just release and it doesn't hurt them. Ah, little fat little guy. We are trying to restock the Susquehanna River with shad. Shad population in a lot of the rivers has died off down towards Virginia and in the Chesapeake, mostly due to pollution, I would say, more so than overfishing. But thank God the Hudson has maintained a good, healthy population. And so actually we're sharing some of ours with Pennsylvania, and there's a possibility we might be sharing more with different states, if they need them.
You want to turn? Okay, 245.
245 pounds.
The dissection today is Well, the various organs will be analyzed for PCB content. We have very little information on Atlantic sturgeon in the Hudson River because we just don't get the opportunity. We test the striped bass every year. We're dealing with 2 parts per million as the Food and Drug Administration tolerance level. They are definitely over 2 parts per million on striped bass, and the commercial fishery is closed. And right now, the recreational fishery has severe restrictions. This fish that we're cutting up, the roe out of that would be worth about $2,000, whereas the fish that was cut up earlier this morning had roughly 24 pounds, and that would have been worth approximately $1,000. So that commercial fisherman, just in that one instance, lost $3,000 worth of revenue.
If all the fish in the river were free of PCBs, then we could make a real good living. We'd be fishing for carp, catfish and bullheads, and eels. There's a tremendous market for eels in Europe, and we have tons and tons of eels in the river.
For me personally, I didn't learn to love the river until I was able to have the opportunity to say, damn this river. You know, I mean, there's nothing is worth, the wind's blowing wrong, the tide's going wrong. I just hate this damn river. When I was able to have that experience, and working with a commercial fisherman, you get to have that experience several times over. I had a different picture of the river. Not just that it was a living thing, but, in the most profound way, it doesn't really care what we do. I mean, there's no... And that leads you to the understanding that there's also no consciousness there. And you try and figure out where the river begins and ends and how you fit into that scheme. And there is no beginning and ending.
$50,000 or $60,000 Algonquian Indians and Iroquoian Indians were living in the Hudson watershed when Henry Hudson sailed up this river 375 years ago. And they left some evidence behind. They left shell mounds, the odd spear point and stone scraper and hammerstone here and there. There was no long-lasting consequence of their having been here for at least 6,000 years that we know of. We've been here for 375 years, and we have left marks that will take tens of thousands and perhaps hundreds of thousands of years to erase. We consume more, we use more, we change things chemically. We live a high-tech life. I can't imagine that we can continue making VCRs, foreign vacations, and closets full of coordinated clothes our top priorities and expect to see environmental improvement as a coincidental byproduct.
People think of environmentalism as a fairly recent concern in this aspect of environment versus commerce and development. But in fact, these concerns have been expressed for about 150 years. And we have records showing that when the railroad was constructed, the railroad came through the Hudson Valley around 1848. When the railroad was constructed, a lot of very prominent people, including Washington Irving, were very upset about the fact that it was going to destroy people's access to the river. It was going to destroy the peace and quiet of the river. And there was a movement afoot to try to derail the railroad. And was unsuccessful. The railroad lobby was very powerful, and they were able to win the right to construct the railroad right along the river's edge.
I see a society that consumes more every single year. It's become profitable to pollute. Politicians can still be bought. Laws and rulings can still be twisted. Enforcement people can still be bought. I think we can effectively slow the process, but I think that the slope is down.
I believe strongly that you got to try and think globally while acting locally.
catching fish, catching hell, hell, fish, up and down the river sailing on.
Now here's the thing. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams put it in one way. They said, how can you have prosperity without commerce? How can you have commerce without luxury? How can you have luxury without corruption? How can you have corruption without the end of the republic? Today, it seems to me, one would have to say, how can one have a technological society without research? How can you have research without researching into dangerous areas? How can you research into dangerous areas without discovering dangerous things? How can you discover dangerous things without this information falling into the hands of insane people like Hitler?
Up, down, up and down the river.
Whenever I get a chance to talk to scientists, I broach this to them. Most of them are rather horrified, because it is a basic religious belief with them that an endless, infinite increase in empirical knowledge cannot but be a good thing.
The river may be dirty now, but she's getting cleaner every
I think before the human race is safe or survives, we will have called into question these very, very basic beliefs we have. I have a deep respect now for the democratic process in USA, which I didn't have, frankly, years ago, because I've seen, with all its stumbling and bumbling, things do happen over a period of time if enough people get involved. And who knows, but what we here in the Hudson may be able to show the world how to save a river.
The great success story of the Hudson is not that the river was brought back to life. The great success story of the Hudson is that we prevented the river from ever being killed. And it's been vigilance and a lot of hard work. It's been lawsuits, a lot of pain, a lot of tears. There's no doubt about it. And it hasn't always been, patting each other on the back. It's been a lot of adversarial stuff. And reputations have been ruined, I'm sure. There are probably some people who financially have been ruined by some pie-in-the-sky dream they've had about the Hudson that hasn't worked out. But we're going to have to do a lot more working together than we've done in the past. We can't lose the hard edge of being willing to fight it out. We, at the Hudson River Fishermen's Association, we investigate, we litigate, we kick and cajole, we lobby, we sponsor research, we do whatever we have to do to make our particular view or vision of the Hudson come true.
Once the sages told a story of a land the Great Spirit blessed.
A friend in Cold Spring, Vic Schwartz, that old woman gave him a book printed in 1908, Sloops of the Hudson. And in 1965, he loans me this book, and late at night, the way over-enthusiastic people will sometimes do, I wrote a 7-page letter. I said, Vic, wouldn't it be great if we could get a few people together and build a replica of one of these boats? Then I forgot about the letter. 4 months later, he meets me. Pete, when are we going to get started on that boat? I think I said, what boat? He said, you wrote me a letter. Well, he said, I've been talking it up on the commuter train. We got a whole batch of people who would like to get started. I said, well, if there's enough nuts around, we just might do it. Who can tell?
thing the Hudson River Valley is blessed with, in probably more than any other part of this country, is an active environmental community. This is your first pumpkin sale, right? And I think that groups like Clearwater have been able to provide some of the focus, provide some of the expertise, but when it comes right down to it, communities are protected by the people in those communities.
Somebody met me in the waterfront of Cold Spring, a very conservative little town. He said, "Seeger, I've got to talk to you." He drew me aside. He said, "Now, I don't want to think I agree with you, not 1/10 of 1%, but that sure is a beautiful boat." He couldn't stop talking about that boat. He couldn't stop talking about it. And the boat has melted hearts. And in the long run, I believe this is one of the hopes of the world, that people who love the beauty of this world will suddenly pause in their murderous designs and saying, the world is too beautiful to destroy.
At the source of the Hudson is the Adirondack Preserve, 6 million acres of forest that must remain forever wild, the largest preserve in the nation. Vice President Theodore Roosevelt was there, camped on its highest peak, Mount Marcy, when a woodsman brought the news of President McKinley's death. Roosevelt changed horse teams and drivers 3 times in his dash to reach North Creek and the train to Albany. He was sworn in en route as 26th President of the United States.
It's important to differentiate between the Forest Preserve and the Adirondack and the Catskill Parks. They are 2 different things, and many people don't understand the difference between the 2. The Forest Preserve was created in 1885 and consists of the public-owned lands or the state-owned land inside the Adirondack and the Catskill counties. The Adirondack Park, which is now 6 million acres in size, includes about 2.5 million acres of public land or forest preserve, and the remainder is private land, so that as you enter the Adirondack Park, you would expect to not see any houses or developments or highways even. But you do, simply because of the mix of public and private land that is there.
As governor of New York, Theodore Roosevelt was inspired by the writings of John Burroughs, a naturalist living on the Hudson and in his retreat, Slabsides. Roosevelt created the Forest Commission, and with it a whole conservation movement began. Governor Franklin Roosevelt, a longtime resident of the valley, continued the tradition, as did Governor Nelson Rockefeller with the Pure Waters Act, and Governor Hugh Carey with the State Environmental Quality Review Act, called SEQR.
Well, I think garbage is the most difficult problem environmentally that we're facing at the moment. It's the hardest to resolve because there is no easy out. There's no win-win solution. So it's a big problem because what goes into landfills, a lot of what goes in there is dangerous. People are throwing away batteries all the time. Cadmium from batteries is extremely dangerous. It's a heavy metal. And we find it very prevalent in landfills. Household dry cleaning fluid is extremely toxic in very small amounts. That's readily thrown away. And that's the kind of chemical where sometimes 1 drop is enough to pollute a whole water supply.
Shed boat on the beach. Here comes the shed.
Just what we've thrown away in Westchester over the last 40 years has resulted in a mountain of garbage that squats on top of what used to be a beautiful 200-acre salt marsh at Croton Point. The salt marsh is gone. We don't know exactly what the repercussions are going to be up there, but that's there in all likelihood for the rest of the time that human beings will have any interest in this particular piece of the world.
We're dealing with some materials that are very dangerous, and those landfills are ticking time bombs. Something needs to be done about them. So we are closing them. And that still leaves you with a problem. What next? And there really are only two solutions available to us. One is to recycle as much material as we possibly can, which requires a complete restructuring of the way we deal with our garbage. It's one thing to ask people to put their garbage out and to have somebody come pick it up and throw it away. It's quite another thing to change the way we package our food, to ask people to sort their garbage. That starts affecting people in a very different way. It's much easier to come up with a technological solution than a social solution. The other thing that we're looking at is resource recovery, which has its own problems. There's a lot of concern about air pollution associated with resource recovery. So I think that you'll see in the next couple of years, you're seeing it already, that every resource recovery facility that is constructed will have the state-of-the-art technology for air pollution control.
We generate about 18.5 million tons of solid waste a year in New York, which amounts to about 1 ton per person per year. The kinds of waste that we have today are so much different than they were, 20, 30, 40 years ago. The chemical industry, which was developed during the Second World War, became extraordinarily prolific. Currently, they produce about 1 new chemical a day. We have a highly chemicalized society, and the quality of the waste stream has been changing dramatically, and it's gotten to a point now where it's particularly poisonous.
The ideal of suburban life has enticed the city dweller since the 1800s. Frederick Law Olmsted, the designer of Central Park, wrote in a report, "Nothing has been more common of late than to recommend building sites on account of the natural beauty of the distant prospect, when the process of building and of so-called improvements in the neighborhood will assuredly destroy both."
And we shouldn't look at it in short-sighted terms. We should say, if the development continues at the same rate as it is now, for the next 100 years or 200 years, what will be left of this environment? Or what will it look like? And if you do that, it then becomes very frightening. If you take just the rate of development in Dutchess County alone and figure out how many farms have gone under and how many acres of good, rich farmland are now covered with asphalt, and project that 100 years, then it becomes scary.
I don't know what we can do about Route 9. I think it's a disaster, but you could see that it was happening. I think it must have been at least 10 years ago I went to hearings on the Route 9 and objected and was shouted down. One of the reasons for it, which I found out, was that an enormous number of speculators had bought small pieces of land and were sitting on it to make a killing. And they had nothing to do with the people who lived here, and they couldn't have cared less.
And I think, and I wrote an editorial about this the other day, I really think the municipalities and the state government and the local governments have to start buying land and setting it aside. And that won't be an easier or popular thing to do, but we've done it successfully in the Adirondacks, we've done it successfully in the Catskills, and the legislature should be setting aside, I don't know, 20 or 30 or $40 million a year simply to buy land. It need not be developed. It need not be turned into parks. There shouldn't be any expense with it. I think now we should say in the Hudson Valley and other places of beauty in the state, we should say that it's time now to start saving this, not for us, but for the ages. Any careful analysis shows that municipalities that are most heavily developed have the highest tax rates. Those that are least developed have lower tax rates, and that's simply because they don't need to provide the governmental services. So if a town has an option between housing development and open space, then they should opt for the open space.
If you think ahead a little bit about this part of the world, I think that it's probably one of the key areas to define the way in which we handle our future. Every single statistic that I look at says that this is one of New York State's prime growth areas. Unless we think about what development in one town may mean to the water supply or to the pollution problems of another area, then I think that we can destroy the quality of life that brought people here. But I think here you pick up a little bit, even through the coatings of modern civilization, what must have been a much older, almost timeless reliance on the seasons and on the weather. The Huguenot houses in New Paltz represent the oldest street in America. They're not a replica, they are the real thing. And they've been standing there since the 1680s. But this has been an area of human habitation for at least 10,000 years. Our archaeological field school at Mohonk revealed to us a 7,000 to 10,000 year old Indian fall hunting site. And I think there is a sense of rootedness. That's one of the concerns, that we will break totally that tie with nature.
Everybody talks about how the United States is moving in the 21st century towards a post-industrial society. We already have a post-industrial society in the Hudson Valley. The old river towns, the cities like Peekskill and Ossining, have lost their industrial bases. They've lost populations, and they've gone through a period of tremendous decline. At the same time the old industrial towns have declined, there is tremendous pressure, population pressure, growth of business in the mid-Hudson Valley. But my major concern is if we don't channel that growth back to the old industrial towns, if we have the same sprawl that you see in Nassau County or in other areas, the Hudson Valley will be gone.
There's a certain volume of bodies and density that is going to turn a profit for a developer. These guys do the numbers, they do them in their heads, they do them while they're waiting for their limousine. Here's all you need to do. The rules are very simple. Maximum density, minimum land, maximum price. And this is Euclidean. This is Pythagoras of real estate. They are trying to get 8 great tomatoes in an itty-bitty can, and there's no genius. Anybody that's ever owned anything they've rented will tell you this. And so people are so surprised that the developer, can you imagine, he's trying to squeeze, of course he is. Developers aren't in business to make pretty buildings. They can make pretty buildings, and I think that the chances are greatly enhanced that a developer will make a nice development if you force them to. And don't be surprised when your local politicians, your local elected officials, they talk endlessly about ratables, and they talk endlessly about the tax revenue. Why should this be so surprising? This is what keeps them awake at night. You want all those sidewalks on the hill fixed, but you don't want your taxes to go up. Why do you think they're elected officials? Because they like having people pick on them all the time? I think they like it because they like to run things. And to run things, it takes money. And development brings money.
The tax question is an interesting one because people have thought that, in particularly commercial development, is going to lower taxes. We did some rather complex analysis of different types of development. Now, this was based on a rural town, and we found that the commercial development did not at all decrease taxes. By the time you increased the services, built the roads, put in the sewer system, whatever, you were not coming out ahead.
43% of North Salem's 22 square miles located in Westchester County is undeveloped. 14% is agricultural. Wanting to protect the historic environment from haphazard growth, Peter Bliss and other citizens led a campaign to update the town's master plan.
We looked at the wetlands, the slopes, the soil conditions, the amount of trees, the access, the circulation of traffic, the amount of water bodies, every possible thing that we could look at that determined what amount of development could take place. I think we probably get the same mix of developers, but I do think that they forget about a lot of the things that I'll say they may want to try and get away with. We have one developer that is before planning board now who's taught us some things. He's come in with some terrific ideas to help minimize the impacts. And the value of the land has increased at a much greater rate than the towns around. People want to live in a town that's well planned.
Buca is a very tough West Point grad with an extraordinarily creative mind, and Green is, they were courageous and they were stupid together at the same time. In that you had to be a bit of a lunatic to walk out there and look at this land covered with 15 and 20-foot piles of garbage and obvious dumping of all sorts of chemicals, and see this glorious view and think, I can make something of this. I mean, it was such a notion that the first time I saw the property and walked through it, I thought, they're mad. They are completely mad. I went in with a small group of people who were kind of ex-Clearwater groups, the environmental organization. I was actually doing PR for Clearwater then for the revival. I was told I was dealing with the devil by actually even talking to the developers, which was a very strange process. The project was imaginative, and what was impressive about Buca and Green was that they'd talk to us, they'd agree to change things. They'd say, what do you want? Help us get there. The developers, Buca and Green, then sold out to Jim Harvey. And Harvey has been very, very good. They even at one point, I didn't like the way the chimneys were laid out. They changed the chimneys. They've listened, they've talked to us. We're still talking.
The most professional architects, like the most professional developers, have tended to cluster around commercial development because that's easier to do by a long shot, and probably has higher and greater profits in it. Most residential development has been done by contractors, but they're not exactly what you call land planners, architects, or terribly sensitive to the environment they're building in. In addition to the 2.5 acres on the north side, which tie into the town's park that we're doing, we have a river walk that runs the whole length of our site and ties the town park to the north and the county's park to the south together, creating a very long and scenic walkway for all members of the public. One of the things that we have tried to do, and it's not easy, is to reach out to the environmentalists, other environmentalists, and other environmental groups. We have all of the very best environmental engineers working with us. We have some of the most prominent environmental attorneys working with us. Our law firm is the one that stopped Westway, and we're really their only developer that they've worked with. In addition to that, we've had some of the environmentalists, John Clark being one of the most notable, who works so closely with the Hudson River Fishermen's Association. He came to us and said, I hear you're the kind of developer that's interested in doing something positive.
One woman actually said, I'd rather see industrial wasteland than see condominiums on that property. I found more and more I couldn't deal with that. And when I realized that our ultimate decision for the village on the zoning change was that if we didn't zone it so they could build condominiums there, Metro North was going to condemn the property, and they were going to continue with their dumping out there, which was illegal, and they intended to build a large warehouse out there. The warehouse would have had equal scenic and visual impact, and the degradation of the property would have gone on, and the waterfront would have been totally lost to this village forever.
One of the things that is most distressing is to see that what used to be beautiful fields become a parking lot for a shopping mall that really, in my opinion, serves very little purpose. Westchester Mall is a classic example. It sits on what used to be some of the best bird watching and duck hunting area in northern Westchester. And right now it is a major shopping center that is economically hurting because after it was constructed 10 years ago, 3 years ago, the Jefferson Valley Mall was constructed and took away a large number of the customers customers from the Westchester Mall. So it just seems to be a game of dominoes where the most recent mall that's constructed is the most economically viable. But in the process, we're left behind with a wake of stores and property that really has been destroyed, and that lowers the quality of life of everybody in the area.
This is where my wife and I frequently walk.
In the wintertime, there used to drive horses right across here.
Oh, yes, and ice boat.
So
Well, those were the days you could skate across the river and skate down to Newburgh easily and up to Poughkeepsie.
We want to use the river for people to come for tourism. Everyone's very gung-ho about tourism. Well, who wants to come if A, the boat can't stop places, and C, it looks awful on each side? Still beautiful, but not the way it was. This is a very new country compared to Europe, and we don't realize that by keeping up some of the best of the old, we are really creating something that's going to be worthwhile for the future.
As Americans, we always see upward mobility as a possibility. And if you're born in Britain or born in many other countries, you know that you're basically going to end up in the same class into which you were born. Therefore, the public knows that they need to have certain public access rights to the shoreline, for example, and they need to have the government act on behalf of the collective masses, the people. In America, I think many people, even if they don't own that private little enclave on the shoreline, they always have that aspiration and that hope that someday they're going to get there and they're going to own that private beach. And they want to preserve their place in line, and they don't want to see that erosion of prerogatives.
People don't realize you had a period of private philanthropy sparking state action. People go through the Hudson Highlands today. They don't realize that what's now known for its natural beauty and has been known for its natural beauty for centuries might have been known for other things. And there were numerous proposals over the years for development of this area. And it's been the leadership of a lot of people, mainly wealthy people, who have had a concern for not only the protection of the natural environment, but also protection of the historical resources of the Hudson Valley.
Altogether, we attract about 7 million people a year to this park system, which is about 3 times as many as Yellowstone National Park.
Opposite Riverdale, the nation's first planned community, the 500-foot-long cliffs of the Palisades were blasted away to provide construction material for New York City until George Perkins, John D. Rockefeller, and J.P. Morgan purchased them and turned 2,200 acres into America's first interstate park.
And so it has been for 85 years. Most of the land that we have brought into this park system, which today aggregates 80,000 acres, by the way, has come through the benefactions of people like J.P. Morgan, Jay Gould, the Rockefellers, the Harrimans, the Perkins, the Stillmans, well-known names in the Hudson River Valley, and others.
Once Livingston Manor was established, starting even just in the first generation after the founder, they were Livingstons of Livingston Manor, and that meant that they were lords over what amounted to a vassal class. I can't believe that that didn't have a profound effect on the way they viewed the world and the way they viewed their fellow men. And in fact, a lot of their behavior throughout the next number of generations bears out the fact that they did have this attitude, which they were born with. It wasn't their fault. They just had it. Robert of Claremont would have loved this room. He would have loved the fact that his descendants collected objets d'art from Paris and brought them back.
that even one of his multi-great-granddaughters was a sculptress who did this little frieze here. He was really the first in the family, as a younger son of the first proprietor of the manor, really the first in the family to fancy himself as a country gentleman. The Livingstons were always traders and merchants as much as they were landlords, and they could not live with the new British trade policies. It was as simple as that. But they were profoundly ambivalent about the democratic process that went along with the revolution. And I think after the war, by and large, they were appalled by what was happening in the country. They didn't like it at all, which is, I think, one of the reasons why a couple of them who were of that generation didn't go any farther than they did. This is Robert R. Livingston, Jr., perhaps the most famous member of the Livingston family, partly because he came to maturity at the time of the Revolution. He served in the Second Continental Congress and at that time was appointed to the committee that wrote the Declaration of Independence. And although he had nothing whatsoever to do with the drafting of that document, some of the luster of that has rather worn off on him. He became the first chancellor of New York State later on that year when New York became a state, and he was largely responsible for the negotiation of the Louisiana Purchase. And then he was one of the financial backers, and in fact was in partnership with Robert Fulton in the building of the first successful steamboat, which eventually came to be known as the Claremont, which is the house where this portrait hangs today. He is justifiably, I think, the most famous member of the family.
I suppose that my interest in land conservation and in historic preservation and the documenting the cultural identity of the Hudson Valley has origins in my own remote family background. My people lived along the river and owned land in the Hudson Valley since the 17th century. In fact, the property that my family now owns, Rokeby at Barrytown, was first acquired by a grant from the king in 1688. So in 1988, we'll be beginning our 4th century of fee title ownership of that property, although the family hasn't actually occupied the land that long. We've only occupied it since about 1811. The feeling in the Livingston family and the related Beekman family in Dutchess and Columbia County, the feeling for the land is one that was developed very early and has kept them on their ancestral land even when the economic motive had long since disappeared. And indeed, in latter days, the cost of maintaining these old family places and the ancestral acres, reducing some people to something close to penury. But this very powerful, almost mystical sense of connection to their land, and then beyond that to all land, to the cultural connection between man and his environment, is a powerful factor.
Well, we had friends up here. We played tennis in the summer, and we did things like that, and then people would give a few parties and every once in a while. Now everybody has to go 100 miles an hour if they're going across the street.
That's quite amusing. It's coming today, isn't it? Yes, aren't you surprised that he's coming today?
Wilderstein is another of the very special and privately owned properties in this historic district. It's in the town of Rhinebeck overlooking the Hudson south of Rhinecliff. And it was built on Livingston family land by a Livingston relative named Suckley in the 1850s, and then largely rebuilt and greatly enlarged in the 1880s. Those who've worked on the place include Tiffany Studios and Calvert Vaux, landscape architect. It's a wonderful, great Queen Anne house, now in need of a good deal of physical attention, with Miss Margaret Suckley still enjoying a life estate there. Working with a number of us, Miss Suckley helped to create a not-for-profit corporation, and I'm privileged to be serving as the president of the board at Wilderstein, and
We are going to have to continuously raise large sums of money to move forward with the restoration and also with the adaptive reuse of these buildings. It keeps me busy, particularly since I have all sorts of problems with Rokeby, my own family place a few miles up the river, which is equally in need of attention.
There we are. Now you better take a cookie. We've had Scotties since 1905. And I had a friend who had one, and she said, well, now I'm going to have puppies with this Scottie, and as soon as I have one, I'll give you one. So she called me up one day in the spring. She said, I have a perfectly wonderful puppy for you. And of course, I was delighted, but I said, well, I don't know how I'm going to manage, because I'm going to spend the winter with Aunt Sophie in New York City in an apartment, and I know I can't take a puppy down there. But I said, why don't you give him to the president? He might like to have one. He used to have one. So when the president came up, I asked him, and he said immediately, oh, he said, I've been longing for one for years. So that's how the Fowler became Fowler. And let's see, the president died in 45. And I think that Fowler lived 2 or 3 years after that with Mrs. Roosevelt. And she told me, she said, every time a car comes around that corner, Fowler rushes out barking. And then he's so disappointed afterwards.
These Republican leaders have not been content with attacks on me, or on my wife, or on my sons. No, not content with that. They now include my little dog, Fowler. Well, of course, I don't resent attacks. And my family don't resent attacks. But Fowler does resent them. You know, Fowler's Scotch. And being a Scottie, as soon as he learned that the Republican fiction writers had concocted a story that I'd left him behind on an Aleutian island and had sent a destroyer back to find him at a cost to the taxpayers of $2 or $3 or $8 or $20 million, his Scotch soul was furious. He has not been the same dog since.
51,000 properties in New York State are listed in the National Register of Historic Places. Another 200,000 are eligible. It is estimated that as many as half the structures that represent our cultural heritage could be lost over the next 15 years.
This landscape has been so highly valued by the Department of Interior that it's in their Silver Book, and therefore is on the same level of significance as Mount Vernon, or the United States Capitol, or the Brooklyn Bridge, or Central Park, or the wagon ruts to Oregon.
This is Springside, the summer home of Matthew Vassar, who was the benefactor of Vassar College. It's a landscape that was designed by Andrew Jackson Downing in 1850 to 1852. It's a remarkable success story, because what we now have are not the condominiums that have been designed for this site, but we have an out-of-court settlement which is arranged for a not-for-profit organization to take over the site when it has established that it has the financial ability to do that.
The City of Poughkeepsie Planning Board seemed to me to have short-circuited the State Environmental Quality Review Act, and the Hudson River Sloop Clearwater Incorporated took out a lawsuit in conjunction with 5 or 6 other local residents, suing the City of Poughkeepsie Planning Board. The battle took about 2 years. The out-of-court settlement has arranged for the Downing-Vassar landscape to remain intact and for the 190 units to be pushed to the southern 23 acres, the acreage that never had any part of the National Historic Landscape. What we have left is a landscape which was the creation of America's first landscape architect, Andrew Jackson Downing. I think the buildings eventually may be replaced, But I think the landscape, particularly considering it's the last one of Downing's that we have, has enough value and enough integrity still to warrant at least $250,000 for its initial restoration.
When the Power Authority of the state of New York held hearings for the construction in Greene County of a nuclear-fueled power plant, Harvey Fladd and others offered testimony on the plant's visual impact on Olana, the nationally landmarked home and grounds, which were designed in landscape by the best known of the Hudson River painters, Frederick Church.
The issues were really to develop, first of all, the fact that the Hudson Valley as a whole is a cultural landscape. It has historical, cultural, and yes, even aesthetic, a body of material that is the Hudson Valley. To do that, I attempted to look at the visual impact that the power plant would have on the cultural and aesthetic landscape.
David Huntington, professor of art history at the University of Michigan, testified that Church's Niagara was seen by 100,000 people when it was first presented to the New York public in 1857. No painting had ever made such an impression on American viewers. This extraordinary painting vibrated with the dynamic of manifest destiny. The wildness of the Hudson Valley inspired a patriotic fervor in painters like Thomas Cole, Church's teacher and founder of the Hudson River School. There was Asha B. Durand in Newburgh and Jasper Cropsey in his studio at Hastings-on-Hudson. These and other artists enlightened a fascinated public and revealed to them an exalted order in nature. Their vision eventually lost meaning in a nation whose rural population was absorbed into urban centers and into a growing industrial economy. The optimism expressed in the American passion to span the continent faded, and with it a reverence for nature. But in 1860, when Church built Olana, he called it the center of the world, the meeting of East and West, nature and civilization, man and woman. 100 years later, the Hudson River School of Painting is back in fashion, and arguments based on aesthetics won the right not to have Olana's views interrupted by a cooling tower. It has also inspired legislation to protect other endangered views. In the future, a Hudson River Valley Greenway will link parks, open spaces, and trails from New York City to the Adirondacks.
What we do basically is we make sculpture, and we're in a very specialized kind of business. And New York City is the art capital of the world. Our goal is that aside from the aesthetic elements of a sculpture as a work of art, that anybody who looks at it would look at it and say, well, this was well done. I was born in Chicago, grew up there, came east, went to Yale, flew airplanes in the Navy, spent a year at Harvard in the School of Design, ended up with a master's degree in metallurgy from MIT. So I was doing work in the high technology foundry business, which means a lot of airplane parts and weapon systems and stuff like that. And I wanted to do something different, to somehow get into doing something that seemed more real, more important to me. My dear friend Sandy Saunders suggested that we might do something on weekends, make sculpture for artists. And I decided I just was going to leave. And so I went from running a foundry with a couple hundred people in it to having it all done exactly as I wanted it, because I was doing it myself. And that was a difficult time in a lot of ways. It was very scary. And now that's changed. I again have become someone whose main job is to make it possible for other people to work. And the river itself is for me, is some kind of grand metaphor about change and things going by, and that somehow pleases me.
Being a policeman, I worked 2 or 3 jobs, and I never saw my kids grow up. So everybody's kids were my kids. And when I did deal with younger people, I didn't want to tarnish their life by locking them up. I would make them responsible to me, because I myself came up with a broken family. I would make them go get a job, and you come back and you show me that you're working. Or I would make them go back into school. I've had kids that some kids now have come to be lawyers. Some have come to be good business people. And then I lost a lot too on the way too. So, but my batting average out of the whole is good, and I feel very proud about that. I did something along the way.
People who are transient trust their work and their ability to work. One of the things you pick up with people who work for the IBMs of the world is that they're going to be wherever they have to be to earn their living. And you see that in the social fabric of the valley when condominiums become a primary housing market. The first thing that you think of is that people who buy a condominium in part are buying it because they don't expect to be there very long. Lower income people generally shift their focus from their income, which is not rewarding at any level. Generally speaking, their sense of identity and their sense of self-satisfaction is derived from the network of relationships. Highly committed to family, highly committed to church, highly committed to ethnic group. That's where their security is. And they will, in fact, pass up the opportunity to work, even at a higher paying job, to go to parts unknown. What does economic development mean in the valley? And it's a big question. And certainly one of the core challenges facing America is that the more routine jobs that are easily learned are increasingly farmed out overseas. And the question today is what is going to happen to America and its productivity as it relates to its competitors around the world.
Most people have not ever seen the products that we manufacture.
Do good out there, bud. Just leave the wrinkle just as it is. Don't make it. No further wrinkles.
Our wire has been to the moon and back. It's in most computers and other sophisticated electronic gear. Really, a lot of changes have taken place in Westchester, most obvious of which is the blossoming corporate office parks and, of course, the flood of people into these white-collar jobs. At the same time, with all this development, there has been a deterioration or a gradual shrinkage of the blue-collar job. This is a cause for alarm because we seem to be going towards a two-class society where one class will work in offices and the other will be on welfare. So it's possible that Westchester will end up being a county without manufacturing. But even if that's the case, I am concerned about the dominance of those interest groups who are pushing for bigger, bigger, bigger. And towards an end, it seems as though they won't be happy until they have blacktopped the whole county. There needs to be more conscious effort to preserve the beauty and the natural state of Westchester and of the Hudson Valley. And we've got to plan it out, not just to satisfy the banking and construction and energy interests that dominate the planning of the county right now.
For the
Hudson Valley to experience sprawl development would be an absolute calamity, and it isn't necessary. We have more than enough land, zoned residential, zoned industrial, zoned commercial, and zoned agricultural, that should remain just as they are. We do not need industrial parks or executive parks stuck out in the middle of our farms or orchards. We have cities that already have existing water and sewer facilities that either in the city or right on the periphery of the city. Build your executive parks there. Build your industries there. That's also where the highway networks all lead to those existing cities. And then let your residential development also cluster near existing villages, cities, and let them slowly expand outward.
This kind of open space is under such pressure now for development. And yet it's just imperative that to preserve the quality of life that we enjoy in the Hudson Valley, that we keep these spaces open and productive the way the Greggs have done. We should do everything we can to preserve farms like this and make it possible for people to come and pick food and to know how it's grown and what the problems of the farmer are, but also to have the sheer pleasure of coming out and tasting fresh food, fresh off the vine. You'll never get it fresher than this.
There are a few places in the valley here that are just, for my money, almost criminal to see a farm that has been purchased and suddenly attached condominiums spreading up and down over the hills. And you say, my God, shades of Long Island, have we learned nothing?
Gotta have players if we're gonna have any winners now. Don't be shy. Shy people never win, no.
Do you know you are my sunshine? Hey, would you do it one more time for me?
Agriculture remains the #1 industry of New York State, a $3 billion industry involving 1/3 of its land area.
Have you seen the giant alligator? You should see this monster today.
In New York and all across the country, as land values have risen, farm acreage has declined.
Yeah. Hello.
I was brought up with horses, and I always missed them. I sold my horses when I got out of high school, and I always missed them. And around 77, I bought a pair of Percherons to use on a farm and to play with a little bit. And I found out that every year we were doing more work with the horses and less with the tractors. And in the last few years, we've done all our plowing and all our planting with the horses. Right now, we have Belgian horses instead of the Percherons. And when these horses are in reasonably good shape, good physical condition, I can plow an acre a day with each horse. I can plant probably 80% as fast as a tractor. So when you plant with a tractor, you plant next to your wheel track. So it packs the ground down. It don't come up as good. It comes up better with the horses. Another fellow asked me, we were having coffee down here, and he said, hey, Brennan, how come you're plowing with the horses when you got a tractor sitting right by the front of the shed? And I said, well, Posty, I get lonesome out there. And then I said, I get out there, did you ever try talking to your tractor?
Health of the economy needs to be balanced with the health of the environment. For just as economic freedom created a standard of living that is the envy of the world, so will the decline of the environment erode the robustness of the most important ecosystem of all, ourselves. In the 1950s, when shopping malls began mushrooming all across America, businesses along Main Street were the first to be devastated by this trend of the future. In the war-demolished cities of Europe, strict zoning laws preserved the old commercial sites until they could be reestablished. Meanwhile, our love affair with the automobile encouraged the suburban township to assert its right to develop any and all of its landscape.
Now, can you do that cap so it doesn't spill? Just get it. Keep all these shrimp nice and perfect. I've been involved with the Hudson River and then undo the almost my whole life, on and off. There were times when I wasn't here, but it's always been, next to my family, the central fact of my existence. Please go back to 74. I don't know what it is or why. Maybe I'm one of the ancient Greeks with a sense of place. Instead of having a spring or a mountain, I have a river. Well, they all lined up? So be it.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Our understanding of the complex chemical, physical, and biological processes that make up the Hudson's estuarine system is still rudimentary. Along with successful efforts to clean up the river, has come an admiration for the Hudson's unexpected resiliency. For not long ago, many considered the river dead, primarily a sewer to flush toxic and organic wastes out to sea. Despite serious PCB and other contamination, 150 species thrive, and the migratory American shad remains an important commercial fish. Protected wetlands offer food and habitat to over 400 species of amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. The biggest threat to the environment today comes from a hasty and impatient development of the Hudson's rediscovered shore. An area north of Newburgh in the Hudson Valley is projected to become the fastest growing locality in the United States. For the first time, all across America, the idea that growth is good is being questioned by everyday people who want to preserve open space, waterfronts, wildlife, and scenic beauty. In the Hudson Valley, ordinary citizens who have never joined an environmental group are becoming newly aware that each part of the river's complex ecosystem is interconnected, even if we lack understanding of its processes. We recognize a miracle when we see one. And we know that a miracle needs tending. We must all become river keepers.